What happens when loyalty to the crown collides with protecting the woman who might save the monarchy itself? On a rain-soaked November evening in 2023, Senior Royal Protection Officer James Mitchell made a decision that would forever change the course of British royal history. For 12 years, he had sworn an oath to protect King Charles III with his life. But when a mysterious package arrived at Buckingham Palace with Catherine's name written in desperate handwriting, Mitchell found himself caught between his duty to the king and a secret that could either destroy the royal family or become their greatest salvation. The package contained something that would make Catherine weep, cause King Charles to question everything he believed about his reign, and force a decorated royal guard to choose between following orders and following his conscience. What was inside that package? Why did King Charles want to destroy it immediately? And how did one guard's act of defiance in the dead of night set in motion events that would test the very foundations of the modern British monarchy? This is the true story of courage, secrets, and the moment when protecting a princess meant defying a king. The rain hammered against the ancient windows of Buckingham Palace with a kind of persistence that made even the most seasoned London residents pause. Senior Royal Protection Officer James Mitchell stood at his post in the East Gallery, his trained eyes scanning the shadows that danced across the marble floors. After 12 years of protecting the royal family, he had learned to read the palace like a favorite book, knowing every creak, every whisper of wine through the corridors. But tonight felt different. It was just past 9 in the evening when the call came through his radio. A delivery had arrived at the staff entrance, marked urgent and personal for the Princess of Wales. Mitchell frowned as he adjusted his earpiece. Catherine wasn't expected to return from her engagement in Wales until the following morning, and all official correspondence went through proper channels during business hours. The package sat on the mahogany table in the security office like an unwelcome guest at a dinner party. It was small, roughly the size of a jewelry box, wrapped in brown paper that had clearly seen better days. The handwriting on the address label was shaky, desperate even, as if written by someone whose hands trembled with urgency or fear. There was no return address, only Catherine's name and title written in black ink that had smudged slightly from the rain. Who brought this? Mitchell asked Constable Peters, the young officer who had processed the delivery. Peters consulted his logbook, his pen hovering over the entries. Elderly woman, maybe 70s, said it was important that the princess received it personally. Wouldn't give her name, just kept saying Catherine would understand when she saw it. Mitchell lifted the package carefully, feeling its weight. Inside, something shifted softly, like fabric or paper. It didn't feel dangerous, but in his line of work, assumptions could be deadly. He was about to call for the standard security screening when his radio crackled to life again. All units, His Majesty is requesting immediate attendance in the blue drawing room. King Charles III stood with his back to the ornate fireplace when Mitchell entered, still holding the mysterious package. The king's usually composed demeanor showed cracks of exhaustion that seemed to have deepened over the past months. The weight of the crown, quite literally and figuratively, had begun to show in the subtle stoop of his shoulders and the new lines around his eyes. "Your Majesty," Mitchell said, offering a respectful bow. Charles turned, his gaze immediately falling on the package in Mitchell's hands. Something flickered across the king's face, an expression Mitchell couldn't quite place. It was neither surprise nor curiosity, but something closer to recognition mixed with dread. "What is that?" Charles asked, his voice carrying an edge that made Mitchell straighten instinctively. "A delivery for the Princess of Wales, sir. It arrived this evening, marked urgent." The king extended his hand. "I'll handle all correspondence for Catherine while she's away." This was unusual. The princess managed her own correspondence, and the king rarely intervened in such matters. But Mitchell was trained to follow orders, not question them. He stepped forward a hand over the package. Charles examined the handwriting on the label, and this time Mitchell was certain he saw recognition in the king's eyes. The monarch's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a tell that Mitchell had learned to notice during his years of service. "This needs to be disposed of immediately," Charles said, his voice carrying the finality of a royal decree. "It's nothing but rubbish. Old letters, meaningless sentimentality. Catherine doesn't need to be troubled with such things." But something in the king's tone didn't ring true. Mitchell had spent years learning to read people's intentions, to spot the subtle signs of deception that could mean the difference between safety and danger. The slight tremor in Charles's voice, the way his fingers gripped the package just a bit too tightly, the avoidance of direct eye contact all suggested this was far from meaningless rubbish. "Of course, Your Majesty. Should I have it incinerated through the usual channels?" "No," Charles replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. "I'll handle it personally." "That will be all, Officer Mitchell." Mitchell bowed again and turned to leave, but as he reached the door, he heard something that made him pause. It was barely audible, more breath than voice, but it sounded like Charles had whispered a name. "Sarah." The sound of that name, spoken with such pain and longing, stopped Mitchell in his tracks. He knew that name, had heard it whispered in the darker corners of royal history. Lady Sarah Spencer, Diana's older sister, the woman Charles had dated before he ever met Diana. The woman who had introduced Charles to his future wife in what history would record as either the greatest love story or the greatest tragedy of the modern monarchy. Mitchell closed the door behind him and walked slowly back to his post, his mind racing. Why would Lady Sarah be sending packages to Catherine? And why would the king want to intercept and destroy them? The whole situation felt like walking through a minefield where one wrong step could trigger explosions that would echo through the halls of the monarchy for generations. As he resumed his position in the East Gallery, Mitchell couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something significant, something that went far beyond a simple package delivery. The rain continued its relentless assault on the palace windows, and in the distance, he could hear the faint sound of Charles's footsteps echoing through the corridors. But it was what he didn't hear that troubled him most. There had been no sound of paper tearing, no rustle of packaging being opened, no footsteps heading toward the incinerator or waste disposal. Just silence, heavy and pregnant with unspoken secrets. Hours passed, and Mitchell found himself checking his watch with increasing frequency. Catherine was scheduled to return in the morning, and protocol dictated that all correspondence be properly logged and secured. But this package had effectively disappeared into the king's private quarters, leaving no paper trail and no record of its contents. At midnight, during his routine patrol of the private residential areas, Mitchell noticed a light still burning in Charles's study. Through the gap beneath the door, he could see the shadow of the king's feet, unmoving, as if he had been sitting in the same position for hours. Mitchell had faced down terrorists, investigated threats against the royal family, and stood guard during some of the most politically sensitive moments in recent British history. But something about this simple package and the king's reaction to it filled him with a sense of unease that all his training couldn't dispel. The next morning brought no resolution, only more questions. Catherine arrived from Wales looking refreshed and energetic, ready to dive into her packed schedule of engagements. During the morning briefing, she asked casually if there had been any messages or deliveries while she was away. Mitchell found himself at a crossroads. Protocol demanded honesty with all members of the royal family, but direct orders from the king took precedence. He watched Charles's face carefully as he responded that there had been nothing of importance. Catherine nodded and moved on to other matters, but Mitchell caught something in her expression, a flicker of disappointment that suggested she might have been expecting something specific. The way her smile faltered for just a moment, the quick glance she shot toward her private secretary, the slight adjustment of her engagement ring all pointed to someone who had been hoping for news that hadn't come. The rest of the day proceeded normally, but Mitchell couldn't concentrate on his duties. Every training session he had attended, every protocol he had memorized, every oath he had sworn pointed in one direction following the chain of command, and protecting the royal family as a unified institution. But what happened when protecting one member of the family meant potentially deceiving another? As evening approached, and the palace settled into its nighttime routine, Mitchell made a decision that would change everything. He had to know what was in that package, how to understand why it had caused such a strong reaction from the king, and why Catherine seemed to be expecting something that never arrived. The king's study was locked, but Mitchell had access codes for emergencies. This wasn't technically an emergency, but the growing sense that he was caught in the middle of something much larger than a simple delivery made him feel justified in bending the rules. He waited until the late shift change at 2 a.m., when the corridors would be temporarily empty as guards rotated positions. The lock disengaged with a soft click, and Mitchell slipped into the study, his heart pounding despite years of training in covert operations. The room smelled of old leather and expensive wood polish, with undertones of the king's preferred cologne. Moonlight filtered through the heavy curtains, casting everything in shades of silver and shadow. Mitchell's eyes adjusted quickly to the darkness, and he began to search systematically. He found the package in the bottom drawer of Charles's desk, still unopened. The brown paper wrapping looked even more shabby in the dim light, and the desperate handwriting seemed to leap off the label. Mitchell lifted it carefully, noting that it felt heavier than before, as if the weight of its secrets had somehow increased. His hands trembled slightly as he began to carefully peel back the tape. Whatever was inside had been important enough for someone to risk approaching Buckingham Palace directly, significant enough to make the King of England lie to his daughter-in-law, and mysterious enough to keep the monarch awake until the early hours of the morning. The paper fell away to reveal a small wooden box, polished to a warm gleam despite its obvious age. There was no lock, just a simple brass clasp that opened with the slightest pressure. Mitchell held his breath as he lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, lay 3 items that made Mitchell's trained composure finally crack. The first was a photograph, black and white and clearly decades old, showing a young Charles and an even younger woman who was definitely not Diana. They were laughing, their faces turned toward each other with the kind of intimacy that spoke of deep affection and shared secrets. The second item was a letter, written in the same shaky handwriting as the package label. The paper was cream-colored and expensive, the kind used for important correspondence. Mitchell could make out only the first few lines in the moonlight, but they were enough to make him understand why Charles had reacted so strongly. "My dear Catherine," the letter began, "I know this may come as a shock, but there are things about your husband's family that you deserve to know. Things about his father that have been hidden for 40 years. I'm dying, and I can't take these secrets with me to the grave." The third item was the one that made Mitchell's blood run cold. It was a small jewelry box, and inside was a ring. Not just any ring, but an engagement ring that looked remarkably similar to the one Catherine wore every day. The same general style, the same type of sapphire, but clearly older and worn by decades of wear. Mitchell stared at the contents of the box, his mind racing to process the implications. If what he was seeing was true, then this wasn't just about an old relationship or forgotten history. This was about secrets that could shake the foundation of the modern monarchy, secrets that someone was willing to die to reveal, and that the king was desperate to keep buried. As he carefully returned the items to the box and rewrapped the package, Mitchell realized that his decision to protect this secret or reveal it would define not just his career, but potentially the future of the royal family itself. The rain had stopped, but the storm brewing within the palace walls was just beginning. The following morning brought an unusually heavy fog that seemed to mirror the cloud of uncertainty hanging over Mitchell's conscience. He had returned the package to its hiding place in Charles's desk, but sleep had eluded him entirely. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that photograph, that ring, and the desperate handwriting of a dying woman who felt compelled to share secrets that had been buried for 4 decades. Catherine arrived at the palace earlier than usual, her normally bright demeanor subdued. Mitchell watched from his post as she moved through the morning routine, noting the way she checked her phone repeatedly and how her conversations with staff seemed distracted. During the security briefing, she asked again about any deliveries or messages, this time with more urgency. "Are you certain nothing arrived yesterday evening?" she pressed her private secretary, Emma Richardson. Nothing at all from anyone outside official channels? Emma consulted her meticulous records, shaking her head. Nothing was logged, ma'am. All official correspondence went through the usual protocols. But Mitchell caught the careful phrasing. Nothing was logged. That didn't mean nothing had arrived, and he suspected Catherine was intelligent enough to read between those lines. The way her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the quick glance she shot toward the king's private quarters, and the slight tap of her fingers against her wedding ring all suggested growing suspicion. King Charles emerged from his study looking haggard, as if he hadn't slept any better than Mitchell. The monarch's usually impeccable grooming showed small signs of distraction, a tie slightly askew, hair not perfectly arranged, and dark circles under his eyes that makeup couldn't quite conceal. When he greeted Catherine at breakfast, their interaction carried an undercurrent of tension that Mitchell had never witnessed before. "Sleep well?" Catherine asked with what seemed like casual concern, but Mitchell detected something sharper beneath the surface. "Quite well, thank you," Charles replied, not meeting her eyes. "Just some paperwork keeping me up. Nothing important." The lie hung in the air between them, like morning mist, visible to anyone who knew how to look. Catherine's smile remained perfectly in place, but Mitchell saw her fingers tighten around her coffee cup. She knew something was wrong, even if she couldn't identify exactly what. Mitchell's radio crackled with a message that made his stomach drop. "Security to the main entrance. Visitor requesting to speak with the Princess of Wales. Says it's urgent regarding a package." The elderly woman standing at the palace gates looked exactly as Constable Peters had described, frail, possibly in her 70s, with silver hair that caught the morning light and eyes that burned with desperate intensity. She wore a simple black coat that had seen better days and clutched a worn leather handbag as if it contained her most precious possessions. "I need to speak with Catherine," she said to the security officer, her voice carrying the refined accent of someone who had once moved in elevated social circles. "Please tell her that Sarah Spencer is here. She'll understand." Mitchell felt his world tilt. Sarah Spencer. Lady Sarah Spencer. Diana's older sister. The woman whose name Charles had whispered with such pain the night before. The woman who, according to royal history, had dated Charles before introducing him to her younger sister in what would become one of the most famous love stories and tragedies of the 20th century. But this woman wasn't supposed to be alive, at least not according to most people's understanding of Spencer family history. Lady Sarah had retreated from public life decades ago, becoming almost mythical in her absence from royal circles. Yet here she stood, very much alive, and demanding to speak with Catherine about a package that was currently hidden in the king's desk. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the princess is unavailable," the security officer replied with professional courtesy. "If you'd like to leave a message or schedule an appointment through proper channels—" "I don't have time for proper channels," Sarah interrupted, her voice rising with frustration and what sounded like physical pain. "I'm dying. Cancer. Weeks, maybe less. That package I sent contains things Catherine needs to know before it's too late." Mitchell's training kicked in. This was a potential security situation, but it was also clearly something much more personal and complex. He approached the group carefully, noting how Sarah's eyes immediately locked onto his uniform and rank insignia. "Senior Royal Protection Officer Mitchell." He introduced himself. "Perhaps I can help clarify the situation." Sarah studied his face with the kind of intensity that came from years of reading people's character. "You have kind eyes," she said finally, "and you look like someone who understands duty. I'm not here to cause trouble, officer. I'm here because there are secrets that have poisoned this family for too long, and Catherine deserves to know the truth before I take it to my grave." "What kind of secrets?" Mitchell found himself asking, though he already suspected he knew at least part of the answer. Sarah glanced around nervously, noting the security cameras and the growing attention their conversation was attracting. The kind that explained why Charles really married Diana, why their marriage was doomed from the start, and why Catherine's position in this family is more precarious than she realizes. The kind that involved promises broken 40 years ago and lies that have been living and breathing ever since. Before Mitchell could respond, His radio crackled again. King Charles was requesting his immediate presence in the blue drawing room. The timing felt far too convenient to be coincidental. "I'll be in touch," Mitchell told Sarah quietly, making a decision that surprised him with its certainty. "Don't give up yet." He found Charles pacing in front of the fireplace, his agitation barely contained beneath the veneer of royal composure. "I understand there's a disturbance at the gates," the king said without preamble. "A visitor requesting to see the princess, Your Majesty." An elderly woman claiming to be Sarah Spencer. Charles went completely still, his face draining of color. For a moment, the carefully maintained mask of monarchy slipped entirely, revealing raw fear and what looked like genuine grief. "Sarah," he whispered, just as he had the night before. "I thought she appears to be very much alive, sir, though she claims to be seriously ill." Charles sank into one of the antique chairs, suddenly, looking every one of his 74 years. "What does she want?" "To speak with the princess about a package, sir." The king's head snapped up, his eyes sharp with alarm. "What package?" Mitchell felt the weight of his deception pressing down on him like a physical force. He could continue the lie, follow orders, and pretend he knew nothing about the mysterious delivery. Or he could break protocol and reveal that he had not only seen the package, but examined its contents. "The package that arrived yesterday evening, Your Majesty. The one you asked me to dispose of." Charles stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. "You disposed of it as ordered, correct?" This was the moment of truth. Mitchell looked into the eyes of the man he had sworn to protect and made a choice that would define the rest of his career and possibly his life. "No, sir. I didn't." The silence that followed was deafening. Charles's face went through a range of emotions: shock, anger, betrayal, and finally, a kind of resigned understanding that suggested he had been expecting this moment for years. "You opened it," Charles said finally. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, sir." "Then, you know why it can't reach Catherine." Mitchell straightened his shoulders. "With respect, Your Majesty, I think you're wrong. I think she has a right to know." The king's laugh was bitter and completely devoid of humor. "A right to know what?" "That her husband's entire relationship with this family is built on lies? That the woman she considers her children's grandmother was never supposed to marry their grandfather? That the engagement ring she wears every day is a copy of one that was meant for someone else?" Each word hit Mitchell like a physical blow. He had suspected some of this from what he had seen in the package, but hearing it confirmed by Charles himself made the magnitude of the deception staggeringly clear. "Sarah was my first love," Charles continued, his voice heavy with 4 decades of regret. "We were engaged, secretly, in 1977. She had the ring, she had my heart, she had my promise of a future together. But then the palace intervened. They said she wasn't suitable, that her family connections weren't strong enough, that I needed to marry someone who would strengthen the monarchy's position." Mitchell remained silent, understanding that this confession had been building pressure like steam in a kettle for decades. "Sarah introduced me to Diana as an act of sacrifice," Charles said, staring at a portrait of his grandmother that hung above the mantelpiece. "She thought if I married her sister, she could at least stay close to our family, watch her children grow up, be part of our lives in some way. But it destroyed her. The guilt, the secrecy, the constant reminder of what might have been. And Diana never knew. Diana suspected, especially after we married. She saw the way Sarah and I looked at each other during family gatherings, noticed how Sarah would disappear for days after visiting us. It became another crack in our marriage, another secret that festered until everything fell apart." Mitchell began to understand the true scope of the tragedy. It wasn't just about Charles and Diana's failed marriage or even about Sarah's broken heart. It was about a deception that had infected 3 generations of the royal family, creating ripple effects that were still being felt today. "Catherine wears a copy of Sarah's ring?" he asked quietly. Charles nodded miserably. "When William proposed, he wanted to use Diana's ring. But Diana's ring was my mother's, and I couldn't bear the thought of more lies. So we had a replica made of Sarah's ring, thinking no one would ever know the difference. Another secret, Another deception, another layer of guilt to carry. And now Sarah is dying and wants to tell Catherine the truth. Now Sarah wants to salve her conscience before she dies. And she doesn't care if it destroys Catherine's marriage, traumatizes my grandchildren, or brings down the monarchy in the process. Mitchell could see both sides of this impossible situation. Charles's desire to protect his family and preserve the institution he was sworn to serve made perfect sense. But so did Sarah's need to finally tell the truth after carrying these secrets for 40 years, and Catherine's right to understand the real history of the family she had married into. What if, Mitchell said carefully, there was a way to handle this that honored everyone's needs? What if Catherine could learn the truth in a controlled way, with support and context, rather than having it explode in her face if these secrets eventually come out another way? Charles looked at him with something approaching hope. What are you suggesting? Let me arrange a private meeting between Sarah and Catherine, away from the palace, away from the press, away from anyone else. Let Sarah tell her story, give Catherine the package, and answer her questions. But do it with your knowledge and blessing, so Catherine knows you trust her to handle the truth. The king was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the fog-shrouded gardens where his grandmother had once walked with secrets of her own. Finally, he spoke. If I agree to this, if I allow Sarah to tell Catherine everything, what guarantee do I have that it won't destroy my son's marriage and traumatize my grandchildren? Mitchell thought of Catherine's strength, her intelligence, her ability to handle crisis with grace and dignity. He thought of William's deep love for his wife and his respect for her judgment. And he thought of the alternative, keeping these secrets buried until they eventually erupted in ways that might be far more destructive. No guarantees, Your Majesty. But I believe Catherine is stronger than you're giving her credit for. And I believe secrets have a way of coming out eventually, whether we want them to or not. At least this way, everyone has some control over how it happens. Charles was quiet again, the weight of 4 decades of regret and responsibility visible in the lines around his eyes. Finally, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the package, holding it like it might explode in his hands. Arrange the meeting, he said quietly. But God help us all if this goes wrong. The abandoned tea room in Richmond had once been a favorite spot for London society, but years of neglect had left it empty and forgotten, making it the perfect location for a conversation that could reshape royal history. Mitchell had chosen the venue carefully, somewhere private enough for complete discretion, yet public enough that both women would feel safe meeting a relative stranger. Catherine arrived first, her casual clothes and minimal security detail designed to attract as little attention as possible. She wore jeans, a simple sweater, and a baseball cap that cast shadows across her face, but nothing could disguise the tension in her shoulders or the way her fingers worried at her wedding ring. "You're certain this is legitimate?" she asked Mitchell for the 3rd time as they waited inside the dusty tea room. "This woman really is who she claims to be?" "Yes, ma'am. I verified her identity through multiple sources. Lady Sarah Spencer, 68 years old, currently receiving treatment for stage 4 pancreatic cancer at a private facility in Surrey." Catherine's expression softened slightly at the mention of illness. Despite everything, her natural compassion was impossible to suppress. "How long does she have?" "Weeks, possibly less according to her doctors." They sat in silence among the covered furniture and dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight. Catherine had agreed to the meeting after Mitchell presented it as a security matter that required her personal attention. But he could see the questions building behind her eyes. She was too intelligent not to sense that this was about much more than a simple security briefing. Sarah Spencer arrived exactly on time, leaning heavily on a walking stick and accompanied by a private nurse who waited outside in their car. Up close, the family resemblance to Diana was unmistakable, the same fine bone structure, the same expressive eyes, though Sarah's were dimmed by illness and decades of carrying impossible secrets. "Your Royal Highness," Sarah said, offering a careful curtsy that her frail body could barely manage. "Please, just Catherine," came the gentle reply. And please sit down. You look like you need a rest. Sarah settled into one of the uncovered chairs with visible relief, studying Catherine's face with an intensity that made the younger woman shift uncomfortably. You look like her, you know. Not physically, but there's something in your expression that reminds me of Diana when she was happy. Catherine's breath caught. This was clearly not going to be a routine conversation. I'm sorry, but I'm not sure why I'm here. Officer Mitchell said it was important, but it is important, Sarah interrupted gently. More important than you can possibly imagine. I'm here because I'm dying, and there are things about your husband's family that you deserve to know. Things that have been hidden for 40 years. She reached into her worn handbag and withdrew the package that had started everything, placing it on the dusty table between them like an offering on an altar. Catherine's eyes immediately locked on her own name written in Sarah's shaky handwriting. I sent this to you 2 nights ago, Sarah continued, but it was intercepted by Charles. He's been trying to protect you from the truth, but I think protection through ignorance is just another form of cruelty. Catherine looked from the package to Mitchell, understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes. You've seen what's inside, she said to him. It wasn't a question. Mitchell nodded. Yes, ma'am. And you think I need to see it too. I think you have a right to make that choice for yourself. Catherine reached for the package with steady hands, though Mitchell could see the slight tremor in her fingers. She peeled away the brown paper wrapping with careful precision, revealing the wooden box inside. When she opened it, her intake of breath was sharp enough to echo in the empty room. That's my engagement ring, she whispered, staring at the ring nestled in blue velvet. No, Sarah said quietly. That's my engagement ring. The one Charles gave me in 1977 when he asked me to marry him. The silence that followed was profound. Catherine's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and, finally, a growing understanding that made her skin go pale. I don't understand, she said finally, though her tone suggested she was beginning to understand all too well. Sarah leaned forward, her voice gentle but unwavering. Charles and I were together for 2 years. Secretly, because the palace thought I wasn't suitable for the future king. We were deeply in love, and we planned to marry despite their objections. That ring was his promise to me. Catherine lifted the photograph from the box, studying the image of young Charles and Sarah laughing together with obvious intimacy. What happened? The palace intervened. They made it clear that our relationship was damaging Charles's position as heir and that I was standing in the way of his duty to the crown. They wanted him to marry someone who would strengthen the monarchy's position, someone younger and more malleable. Diana. Yes, but not immediately. Charles resisted for months. He was prepared to give up his claim to the throne rather than give up our relationship. But then his grandfather died, and the pressure became unbearable. The monarchy needed stability, not scandal. Catherine set down the photograph and picked up the letter, her hands now visibly shaking. May I? Sarah nodded. It's why I'm here. As Catherine read, her face reflected a journey through disbelief, anger, hurt, and, finally, a deep sadness that seemed to age her before Mitchell's eyes. The letter laid out everything: Sarah's secret engagement to Charles, the palace's interference, the impossible choice they faced, and the ultimate sacrifice that shaped decades of royal history. You introduced Charles to Diana, Catherine said when she finished reading, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought if I couldn't have him, at least I could help him find happiness with someone I loved. Diana was my baby sister, so full of life and hope. I thought she could give Charles what I couldn't: a future without secrets and shame. But it didn't work out that way. Sarah's laugh was bitter. Diana was too smart and too intuitive. She sensed there was history between Charles and me, but she could never pin down exactly what it was. It became another source of tension in their marriage, another secret festering beneath the surface. Catherine carefully returned the letter to the box, her movements deliberate and controlled. Why are you telling me this now? What do you want me to do with this information? I want you to understand that your marriage to William is built on a foundation of lies and compromises that go back 2 generations. I want you to know that the ring you wear every day was copied from one that represented a love affair the palace destroyed for political convenience. And I want you to decide for yourself whether you can live with that knowledge or whether you need to do something about it. Mitchell watched Catherine process this information, noting the way she unconsciously touched her engagement ring as if seeing it for the first time. The ring that millions of people had admired as a symbol of Diana's legacy and William's devotion was actually a replica of a secret promise made decades earlier to a different woman entirely. Does William know? Catherine asked finally. No, sarà riplay. Charles couldn't bear to tell him the truth. He was afraid it would change how William viewed his parents' marriage and his own relationship with the royal family. But you think he should know. I think secrets have a way of destroying everything they touch. Look what they did to Charles and Diana's marriage. Look what they did to my relationship with my family. Look what they're still doing to Charles, who carries this guilt like a stone in his chest 40 years later. Catherine stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the Richmond streets where ordinary people were going about their ordinary lives, unaware that the future of the monarchy was being decided in an abandoned tea room. If I tell William, it will devastate him, she said without turning around. He idolizes his father's sense of duty and sacrifice. Finding out that Charles gave up his true love for the crown will either make William question everything he believes about monarchy, or it will make him fear that duty will eventually force him to make the same impossible choices. And if you don't tell him, Catherine turned back to face them, and Mitchell was struck by the strength he saw in her expression. This was the woman who had modernized the royal family's approach to mental health, who had stood strong during the scandals and controversies of recent years, who had earned respect through grace under pressure rather than inherited privilege. If I don't tell him, then I become part of the deception. I become someone who keeps secrets from her husband about his own family's history. Sarah reached across the table and gently touched Catherine's hand. I'm sorry to burden you with this, but I couldn't die knowing that another generation was living with lies that aren't of their making. What about Charles? Have you spoken to him about this meeting? Mitchell cleared his throat. His Majesty gave his permission for this conversation, ma'am. He understands that you have a right to know the truth. Catherine's eyebrows rose in surprise. He knows we're here? Yes. He wasn't happy about it, but he agreed that secrets have caused enough damage to this family. For the first time since the conversation began, Catherine smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. That must have been terrifying for him. I think he's been terrified for 40 years, Sarah said softly. Terrified that the truth would come out in ways he couldn't control. Terrified that his choices would destroy his relationship with his children. Terrified that the monarchy he sacrificed everything to serve would be damaged by his personal failures. Catherine sat back down, her decision crystallizing in her expression. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Sarah nodded. Do you regret what happened? Do you regret giving Charles up and introducing him to Diana? Sarah was quiet for a long time, her eyes focused on something beyond the dusty room. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of 4 decades of reflection. I regret the lies. I regret the secrecy. I regret the way Diana suffered because she could never understand why her marriage felt like it was built on quicksand. But I don't regret the sacrifice itself. Charles has been a good king, and he's raised good sons who will continue that legacy. Sometimes the greatest act of love is letting someone go so they can become who they're meant to be. Catherine carefully closed the box and held it in her hands like a sacred object. I'm going to tell William. All of it. And then we're going to decide together how to handle this information. And if he can't handle it, then we'll work through it together. That's what marriage is supposed to be, built on truth, even when the truth is difficult. Sarah smiled, and for the first time, Mitchell could see echoes of the vibrant young woman in the photograph. Diana would have been proud of you. As they prepared to leave, Sarah had one more surprise. There's something else you should know. The ring you're wearing, the copy that Charles had made, it's not exactly the same as mine. Catherine looked down at her engagement ring in confusion. What do you mean? Look at the inscription inside the band. Catherine slipped off her ring and angled it toward the light, reading the tiny engraved words inside the band. Her eyes widened as she read. "What does yours say?" she asked Sarah. Sarah opened the box and showed Catherine the inscription in her ring. Where Catherine said, "Forever in my heart," Sarah said, "Until my dying day." "Charles chose different words for your ring," Sarah explained. "Words that reflected not the past, but the future. Words that belonged to William's love for you, not to our history." Catherine stared at both rings, understanding finally, dawning completely. He was trying to honor the past while creating something new. "I think so. I think that ring you wear represents Charles's hope that his son could have the kind of love he was forced to give up. It's not a replica of a broken promise. It's a symbol of dreams fulfilled through the next generation." As they said their goodbyes and prepared to leave the tea room, Mitchell reflected on what he had witnessed. Secrets that had poisoned 3 generations of relationships were finally being exposed to light and air. The truth was painful, complicated, and messy, but it was also liberating. Catherine paused at the door, turning back to Sarah one last time. "Will you be all right? I mean, now that you've shared this burden?" Sarah's smile was peaceful in a way that spoke of tremendous relief. "For the first time in 40 years, yes. I think I will be."